The chipped porcelain mug felt heavy in Clara's hands, its warmth a fragile shield against the diner's indifferent chill. Outside, a bleak November drizzle wept down the plate-glass window, blurring the world into gray submission. She nursed the last of her coffee, a bitter, lukewarm brew she couldn't afford to refresh. It was her third hour at the corner booth, a place she'd claimed to escape the echoing silence of her house. A house that felt less like a home and more like a tomb she was failing to maintain. Every creak of its aging timbers sounded like a judgment. Every unpaid bill on the kitchen table was a paper ghost haunting her waking hours. Her husband, Mark, had loved that house. He'd hammered his spirit into its very frame, and now, alone, she felt the nails loosening one by one. Across the worn linoleum floor, Silas Thorne slid into the vinyl seat opposite her, uninvited. His presence was a slick stain on the faded ambience of the place. He smelled of cloying cologne and cheap ambition, a scent that always made Clara's stomach clench. He laid a sheaf of papers on the table, their crisp edges a stark contrast to her worn, frayed cuffs. "Clara," he began, his voice a low, condescending purr. "We need to talk. This has gone on long enough." He didn't wait for a reply, instead tapping a manicured finger on the topmost document. It was an offer, the same insultingly low figure he'd proposed a month ago, dressed up in new legal jargon. "My investors are getting impatient. This is my final offer. It's more than generous for this," he gestured vaguely toward the window, in the direction of her neighborhood, his lip curling with disdain. The other patrons, a few tired truck drivers, a young couple sharing fries, the waitress wiping down the counter, studiously ignored them. They'd seen this little drama play out before. The frail widow and the predatory developer. It was a story as old as the cracked pavement outside. Their silence was a form of complicity, a collective turning away that left Clara utterly, terrifyingly alone. Her gaze dropped to her hands, the skin thin as parchment over her knuckles. She felt their eyes on her, their pity, their dismissal. She was just a sad, stubborn old woman, a footnote in the town's relentless march toward progress. Thorne leaned closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that felt louder than a shout in the hushed diner. "Face it, Clara. You're out of money. You're out of time. The roof is leaking, the furnace is shot. You can't win. Just take the money and find a nice little apartment somewhere. Disappear. It's for the best." Humiliation burned hot in her throat, a sickening wave of shame and fury. He was right. She was failing. The house was cold, the nights were long, and the weight of it all was crushing her. But it was Mark's house, their house. The thought of his memory being bulldozed for a row of soulless townhomes was a pain sharper than any hunger pang. Her eyes, misty with unshed tears, scanned the room for an escape, for any anchor in the swirling vortex of her despair. They landed on a man at the counter. He was immense, a mountain of leather and denim, his back to them. A thick, graying braid fell past his shoulders, and the back of his worn vest was adorned with a patch she couldn't quite make out. He hadn't moved, hadn't flinched at Thorne's invasive presence. He just sat there, nursing a black coffee, a figure of absolute stillness in her chaotic world. An impulse, born of pure, animal desperation, seized her. Before she could think, before her own quiet nature could smother the spark, she stood up. Her chair scraped loudly against the floor, drawing a few annoyed glances. She walked past Thorne, who watched her with a smug, triumphant smirk, assuming she was retreating in defeat. She walked right up to the biker at the counter. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of fear and resolve. She leaned in close, her lips brushing the shell of his ear, the scent of road dust and old leather filling her senses. In a voice barely audible, a ghost of a sound frayed with terror, she whispered, "I'm not safe." The world seemed to hold its breath. The biker's shoulders, broad as an oak plank, went rigid. He didn't turn his head. He didn't speak. For a long, agonizing moment, Clara thought he hadn't heard, or worse, that he was ignoring her. The weight of every silent onlooker pressed down on her. Thorne's soft, mocking chuckle reached her from the booth. Defeated, she turned to leave, the last ember of her hope extinguished. But then, the man's hand, calloused and huge, slowly lifted from the counter. He raised a single finger, a silent command for her to wait. He took a slow sip of his coffee, placed the mug down with a deliberate, soft click, and then, with an unnerving calm, he began to turn. Thorne's smug expression faltered as the biker turned to face him. The man's face was a roadmap of hard miles and harder fights, a craggy landscape dominated by a formidable gray beard and eyes that held the cold, flat light of a winter sky. The patch on the front of his vest was now visible, a grim, winged skull. Hell's Angels. A tremor of unease rippled through the diner. This was not just some weekend warrior. This was the real thing. The biker, whose nameplate read Grizz, pinned Thorne with a look that was devoid of emotion but heavy with unspoken consequence. He didn't say a word. He simply looked from Thorne's pale, suddenly sweating face to the papers on the table, then back again. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Thorne, accustomed to being the predator, now found himself prey. He licked his lips, his bravado evaporating like morning mist. "This is a private conversation," he managed, his voice a thin, reedy thing. Grizz's expression didn't change. He just held his gaze, a silent, immovable object of judgment. Thorne's confidence crumbled completely. He snatched the papers from the table, his movements clumsy and hurried. "Fine. Have it your way, Clara," he stammered, not looking at her, his eyes locked on the biker. "We'll do this the hard way." He practically fled the diner, shoving past the door into the rain without a backward glance. The bell above the door chimed his frantic retreat. The diner's occupants slowly let out a collective breath, their gazes shifting from the empty doorway to Clara and the biker. The air was thick with questions, but no one dared to ask. Clara stood frozen, her hand pressed to her chest, her heart still racing. Grizz turned back to his coffee as if nothing had happened. He slid a $5 bill under his mug, stood up, and walked toward the door. As he passed Clara, he paused for a fraction of a second. He didn't look at her, but his voice, a low rumble like distant thunder, reached her. "Go home. Lock your door." Then he was gone, the bell chiming his departure, leaving behind a silence that was entirely different from the one that had preceded it. It was no longer a silence of indifference, but one of stunned, uncertain anticipation. Clara, trembling, did as she was told. Back in the cold shell of her house, Clara wrapped herself in one of Mark's old flannel shirts, the worn fabric still holding the faintest ghost of his scent. The encounter in the diner replayed in her mind, a dizzying loop of fear and a strange, unfamiliar flicker of hope. Why had she done that? Why had she, a woman who had spent her entire life avoiding confrontation, turned to a complete stranger, a man who radiated danger? The answer lay in the very walls around her, in the memories that clung to the house like ivy. This wasn't just wood and plaster. It was a living archive of her life with Mark. She ran a hand over the rough-hewn mantelpiece he had installed himself. He'd spent a whole weekend on it, cursing and sweating, refusing her offers of help, his brow furrowed in concentration. When he was finished, he'd stood back, covered in sawdust, and given her that slow, proud smile that always made her heart ache. "A home needs a hearth, Clara," he'd said, his voice thick with satisfaction. "A place to gather. A center now." The hearth was cold and dark. Mark had been a man of quiet principles, forged in the crucible of 2 tours overseas. He rarely spoke of his time in the service, but it had shaped him, leaving behind a deep-seated code of honor that governed his every action. He believed in loyalty, in standing your ground, in protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. He had a particular affinity for the outliers, the forgotten men. She remembered him once stopping their car on a desolate highway to help a group of bikers whose motorcycles had broken down. Clara had been nervous, clutching her purse as Mark, unarmed and unassuming, walked toward the intimidating figures. He'd spent 2 hours with them, his head under the hood of a rumbling machine, his hands covered in grease, talking in a low, easy language she didn't understand. When he was done, the lead biker, a man not unlike the one in the diner, had clasped Mark's arm, a silent, profound gesture of respect. He understood them, Clara whispered to the empty room. He said they were just soldiers of a different kind, loyal to their own flag. Perhaps that memory, buried deep, had guided her actions in the diner. In her moment of ultimate vulnerability, she had reached for the kind of man Mark would have respected, a man who lived by a code. Her small garden, now dormant under the autumn chill, was another testament to him. He'd tilled the soil himself, turning the hard, clay-packed earth into a fertile bed for her roses and tomatoes. "You have to fight for beauty in this world, Clara," he told her, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of a dirty glove. "It doesn't just happen now." Tending the garden was her own quiet fight. It was an act of defiance against the decay that threatened to consume her home and her spirit. Every weed she pulled was a small victory against Silas Thorne. Every bulb she planted for the spring was an act of faith in a future she could barely imagine. But the fight was taking its toll. The legal notices from Thorne's lawyers were piling up, each one a carefully worded threat designed to chip away at her resolve. They cited obscure zoning laws, fabricated code violations, and imminent domain clauses that felt like a betrayal of everything Mark had believed he was fighting for. The language was cold, impersonal, and utterly soul-crushing. Thorne was a different kind of enemy from the ones Mark had faced. He didn't use bullets. He used paper cuts, 1,000 tiny wounds meant to make her bleed out slowly. The house itself seemed to be siding with him. The faucet in the kitchen sink had developed a persistent drip, a tiny, maddening metronome counting down her remaining time. A dark stain had appeared on the ceiling of the bedroom, a grim map of the roof's surrender to the relentless rain. Each new problem was a fresh wave of despair. She felt so terribly alone, a solitary soldier defending a forgotten outpost, her ammunition dwindling, the enemy closing in from all sides. Holding the flannel shirt tighter, she walked to the window and looked out at the rain-slicked street. The world felt hostile and vast. The biker's words echoed in her mind. "Go home. Lock your door," she had. But she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that a simple lock wouldn't be enough to keep the wolves at bay. The following days were a study in escalating psychological warfare. Thorne, stung by his public humiliation at the diner, abandoned all pretense of civility. The first salvo was a team of surveyors who arrived unannounced at dawn. 3 men in bright yellow vests hammered stakes into her lawn, their movements efficient and utterly indifferent to the violation they were committing. They trampled the dormant rose bushes Mark had so carefully planted, their heavy boots churning the soft earth into mud. Clara watched from her window, her hands clenched into fists, a silent scream trapped in her chest. She wanted to run out, to tell them this was sacred ground, but the sheer, bureaucratic arrogance of their presence paralyzed her. They had clipboards and permits. She had only memories. Her neighbors peeked through their blinds, their curtains twitching. She saw Mrs. Gable from next door shake her head with a look of pity before turning away to her morning coffee. Mr. Henderson across the street, who had once borrowed Mark's tools for a weekend project, now busied himself with taking out his recycling bin, his gaze fixed firmly on the pavement. Their silence was a wall, isolating her as effectively as any fence. They didn't want trouble. They saw her as a lost cause, her fight a mere inconvenience delaying the inevitable rise in their own property values that Thorne's development promised. Next came the notices. Not from Thorne's lawyers this time, but from the city. They were plastered on her front door, bright orange and red flags of official condemnation. A violation for a structurally unsound front porch, a citation for overgrown vegetation, referring to the ivy that Mark had loved, the ivy that climbed the chimney like a faithful guardian. A warning about improper waste disposal, because her garbage can lid had been knocked askew by the wind. Each notice was a fresh stab, a public branding of her failure. People walking their dogs would pause, read the notices, and glance at the house with judgmental eyes. The whispers started to travel up and down the quiet street. "She's really let that place go. Such a shame. Why doesn't she just sell? No one considered the possibility that she was being systematically targeted. It was easier to blame the victim. Clara felt their judgment like a physical weight. She became a prisoner in her own home, the shame too heavy to allow her to face them. She'd wait until dark to retrieve her mail, moving like a thief in the shadows of her own porch. The pressure mounted relentlessly. Thorne's strategy was clear: to break her not with one decisive blow, but to erode her will, to make her feel so isolated and powerless that surrender would feel like a relief. He parked his luxury car across the street for hours at a time, simply watching her house, a smug smile on his face whenever he caught her looking. It was a predator's tactic, a constant, unnerving presence designed to fray her nerves. One evening, as dusk settled, two young men, their faces hard and their posture aggressive, loitered at the end of her driveway. They didn't do anything, not at first. They just stood there, smoking cigarettes, their eyes tracking the windows of her house. They were Thorne's hounds, let off the leash to intimidate her. Clara watched them from the living room, her body rigid with fear. The police wouldn't come. They weren't technically doing anything illegal. They were just there, a physical manifestation of Thorne's menace. She sank onto the sofa, the house groaning around her. The dripping faucet seemed to mock her. The stain on the ceiling looked like a weeping eye. She felt herself starting to fracture, the quiet strength she had clung to for so long beginning to crumble under the relentless siege. She closed her eyes, her head in her hands. The image of the biker in the diner surfaced again, a fleeting, impossible thought. A whisper in an ear, a single finger raised in the air. It felt like a dream, a moment of madness. Nothing had come of it. He had told her to lock her door, and she had, but the monsters were still outside, and they were getting closer. Hope, she realized with a fresh wave of despair, was the cruelest torture of all. The night deepened, bringing with it a biting wind that rattled the window panes. The two young men at the end of the driveway finally stirred. Emboldened by the darkness and the street's utter silence, they began their advance. Their laughter, sharp and ugly, cut through the night air as they swaggered onto her lawn. Clara watched, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. The first sound was the splintering of wood. One of them kicked a leg off the small garden bench Mark had built, sending it crashing to the ground. The other picked up a loose rock from the flower bed and hurled it, not at a window, but at the siding, leaving a deep, ugly scar. They were toying with her, a cruel and deliberate act of vandalism designed to terrorize. This was it, the final push, the moment she was supposed to break, to call Thorne, weeping, and beg him to take the house. But something inside her, something deeper than fear, refused to shatter. It was the memory of Mark's hands, calloused and capable, building that bench. It was the echo of his voice, telling her to fight for beauty. This was not just an attack on her property. It was a desecration of his memory. Slowly, deliberately, Clara stood up. She walked to the hallway closet and retrieved the one thing she cherished most. It was a simple, framed photograph of Mark in his dress uniform, his eyes clear and steady, a quiet strength in his young face. It was the photo from his first deployment, the one she had clutched every night he was gone. Holding it tightly to her chest, she unlocked the front door and stepped out onto the porch. The wind whipped at her thin nightgown, but she didn't feel the cold. The two men stopped, startled by her sudden appearance. They had expected tears, screams, the frantic dialing of a phone. They had not expected this. A lone, frail woman in the dark, holding a picture frame. "What do you want, old lady?" One of them sneered, though his bravado was noticeably thinner now. Clara didn't answer him directly. She simply held up the photograph, the porch light glinting off the glass. Her voice, when it came, was not loud, but it carried on the wind with an unshakable clarity. "This was his home," she said, her gaze fixed on them, unwavering. "He fought for this country. He built this house with his own hands. You will not desecrate it." There was no plea in her voice, no tremor of fear. It was a statement of fact, a line drawn in the sand of her soul. The men exchanged a nervous glance. This was not in the script. They were bullies used to preying on weakness, and they had found none here. They had found something else, something they didn't understand. Clara took a step forward, her bare feet cold on the rough wood of the porch. "He is gone," she continued, her voice thick with a grief that was as powerful as any weapon. "But his honor remains, and I am its keeper." The raw, unvarnished truth of her words hung in the air between them. The photograph in her hands was no longer just a picture. It was a symbol, a testament to a life of service and sacrifice that shamed their petty vandalism. The first thug, the one who had kicked the bench, looked down at his feet, suddenly unable to meet her eyes. The other shuffled nervously, the rock he was holding now feeling heavy and obscene in his hand. He let it drop to the grass with a soft thud. A light flicked on in Mrs. Gable's house next door. A curtain twitched across the street. For the first time, her neighbors were not just peeking. They were watching, drawn by this strange, quiet confrontation. They saw not a victim, but a warrior, armed with nothing but love and memory. The thugs, unnerved and exposed, mumbled something incoherent and began to back away. They retreated off her lawn, their earlier swagger gone, replaced by a hurried, almost shameful shuffle as they disappeared into the darkness. Clara remained on the porch for a long moment, the cold wind a stark contrast to the fierce, protective fire burning within her. She had not won the war, but she had won this battle. And she had done it not by matching their ugliness, but by holding up the light of something beautiful and true. The retreat of the two thugs left a profound silence on the street, a quiet that was different from all the ones that had come before. It was not the silence of indifference or fear, but of contemplation. Lights remained on in several houses, the residents behind their windows no longer just passive observers but witnesses. They had seen Clara, whom they had dismissed as a fragile recluse, stand her ground with a courage that shamed their own inaction. They had seen her transform from a neighborhood problem into a figure of unexpected fortitude. The whispers that had once been laced with pity and judgment began to change their tune. The next morning, as Mrs. Gable collected her newspaper, she met Mr. Henderson's eye across the street. There was no need for words. A slow, respectful nod was exchanged. They had both seen it. They had both felt the shift. The broken bench and the scarred siding were no longer symbols of Clara's decay, but badges of her resilience. The narrative they had all accepted, of the stubborn old woman holding back progress, had been shattered. A new one was beginning to form, the widow protecting her husband's legacy. Clara, exhausted but resolute, spent the morning trying to repair the damage. She gathered the splintered pieces of the bench, her hands aching with the effort. She tried to scrub the ugly gash on the siding, but the mark remained, a stark reminder of the previous night's violation. She worked with a quiet determination, her movements slow but steady. She felt the eyes of her neighbors on her, but for the first time, she did not feel judged. She felt seen. Around noon, a car pulled up. It wasn't Thorne's sleek sedan. It was Mrs. Gable's minivan. She got out, carrying a thermos and a plate of sandwiches. She walked right up Clara's driveway, her expression a mixture of apology and admiration. "I saw what you did last night, Clara," she said softly, placing the offerings on the porch railing. That was brave Clara, stunned by the gesture, could only nod, a lump forming in her throat. "He was a good man, your Mark," Mrs. Gable added, her gaze falling on the broken bench. "He deserved better than this." It was the first crack in the wall of isolation that had surrounded Clara for months. A few minutes later, Mr. Henderson appeared with a toolbox. "Figured I could fix that bench for you," he grumbled, avoiding eye contact but unable to hide the respect in his voice. "It's the least I can do. Mark was always helping me out." A small crowd of onlookers began to gather at a respectful distance, their curiosity now tinged with a nascent sense of community responsibility. They were beginning to understand that their silence had been a form of complicity, and that Clara's fight was, in some small way, their own. The street was no longer just a collection of houses. It was becoming a neighborhood again. But even as this small pocket of support began to form, a deeper, More profound shift was on its way, rumbling toward them from miles away, an answer to a desperate whisper spoken in a lonely diner. It started as a low, distant hum, a vibration felt more than heard. At first, people dismissed it as a passing truck on the nearby highway, but the sound grew steadily, deepening into a guttural roar that seemed to make the very air tremble. It was not one engine, but many, a symphony of controlled explosions that spoke of raw, untamed power. Heads turned. Conversations faltered. The sound grew louder, closer, an approaching storm of thunder and chrome. Then they appeared. Turning the corner at the end of the street was a single motorcycle, its rider sitting tall and broad. It was Grizz. Behind him, 2 more bikes fell into formation. Then 4. Then 8. The procession seemed endless. They poured onto the quiet residential street like a river of steel and leather, a phalanx of polished chrome, gleaming black paint, and grim-faced men. They were a legion. Onlookers, who had gathered to watch Mr. Henderson mend a bench, now stood frozen, their mouths agape. This was not a local riding club out for a Sunday cruise. The winged skull on their vests was unmistakable, a symbol of a brotherhood that operated by its own laws and answered to no one. Hell's Angels. They filled the street, their engines idling in a deafening, percussive chorus. One by one, they parked not haphazardly, but with a disciplined precision that was both impressive and terrifying. They formed a perfect, formidable line directly in front of Clara's small, battered house, creating a chrome and leather wall that sealed it off from the world. The final count was staggering. 62 motorcycles, 62 silent, imposing figures standing guard. Grizz cut his engine, and the sudden, relative quiet was more jarring than the noise had been. He swung a heavy leg over his bike and walked toward Clara's porch, his boots clicking with authority on the asphalt. The neighborhood held its breath. Clara, who had been watching from her doorway, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs, saw him approach. He stopped at the bottom of her steps, removed his sunglasses, and looked at her, his expression unreadable but devoid of any threat. The entire world seemed to be waiting for him to speak. Grizz stood at the foot of her porch steps, a giant silhouetted against the army he had brought with him. The gathered neighbors watched in a state of suspended animation, a mixture of fear and awe holding them captive. Clara clutched the doorframe, her knuckles white. She had whispered a single sentence into this man's ear, and in response, he had summoned a force of nature. Grizz's gaze was steady as he looked up at her. He didn't smile, but the coldness she had seen in the diner was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like paternal concern. He gestured with his chin toward the scarred siding and the broken bench. "Heard you had some trouble," he rumbled, his voice low but carrying easily in the charged silence. Clara could only manage a nod, her throat too tight for words. He then looked past her, his eyes scanning the faces of the neighbors. He wasn't addressing them, but he knew they were his audience. This was not just about protection, it was about testimony. "Some of you might be wondering why we're here," he began, his voice taking on a formal, almost ceremonial tone. "It's because of a debt of honor." He paused, letting the words sink in. He reached into his vest and pulled out a worn, faded photograph, not unlike the one Clara had held the night before. It showed 2 young men in dusty combat fatigues, grinning somewhere hot and sandy. One was a younger, leaner version of Mark. The other was a man no one there recognized. "This is my father," Grizz said, tapping the second man in the photo. "And this," he tapped Mark, "is Sergeant Mark Jensen, my dad's squad leader." A murmur went through the small crowd. "My father's convoy was hit by an IED," Grizz continued, his voice flat, reciting a story that was clearly etched into his soul. "He was thrown from the vehicle, wounded, separated from his unit. He was alone, bleeding out in the desert. The order was given to fall back, to consolidate. It was the smart tactical move. But Sergeant Jensen, he disobeyed that order." Grizz's eyes found Clara's. "He went back for my father, alone. He carried him over a mile on his back under enemy fire. He saved his life that day. My father came home because of this man. He held up the photograph again, a sacred relic. My dad told me that story 100 times before he passed. He told me, if you ever have the chance to repay the honor of a Jensen, you take it. No questions asked. He folded the photograph carefully and tucked it back into his vest, a gesture of profound reverence. When you spoke to me in the diner, he said, his voice softening as he addressed Clara directly, I didn't know who you were, but a woman in distress, whispering for help, that's enough for us. So I made a call, found out your name, found out you were Mark Jensen's widow. He shook his head slowly, a look of grim disbelief on his face. To find out that the wife of a man like that was being terrorized, run out of his own home, that is a dishonor we could not let stand. He turned his head and swept his gaze over the 61 silent men standing by their bikes. So we're here to pay a debt. We're here to honor a hero. This house is under our protection. The revelation washed over the street, a powerful tide of truth that swept away all the petty judgments and assumptions. Mark Jensen wasn't just a name on a mailbox. He was a hero, and Clara wasn't a stubborn old woman. She was the guardian of his legacy, a legacy that had just been given a voice 62 times over. Mrs. Gable brought a hand to her mouth, tears welling in her eyes. Mr. Henderson stared at the ground, his face a mask of shame and regret for his earlier indifference. The silence that followed Grizz's declaration was one of profound, humbling respect. The bikers, who had seemed like an invading army moments before, were now transformed in the eyes of the community. They were not outlaws. They were guardians. They were the honor guard Mark Jensen had earned but never received. The truth, delivered with the blunt force of a sledgehammer, had realigned the entire world on that quiet suburban street. The bikers did not just stand guard. They went to work. The transformation was immediate and astonishing. Without a word, they broke off into small, efficient teams, their movements coordinated with the same discipline they had shown upon arrival. It was as if a switch had been flipped, turning a static display of power into a dynamic force of restoration. Two men, one with arms as thick as tree trunks, descended on the broken bench. They didn't just mend it. They disassembled it, sanded down the old wood, and began to put it back together with new screws and wood glue. Their work more meticulous than Mr. Henderson could have ever managed. Another group swarmed the front of the house. A ladder appeared, and a wiry biker shimmied up to inspect the roof, calling down observations in a gruff shorthand to a man below who was already on his phone, presumably ordering shingles. Others began scraping the scarred siding, preparing it for a fresh coat of paint. The sound of hammers, saws, and quiet, focused conversation replaced the intimidating roar of their engines. They moved with a purpose that was both humbling and beautiful to watch. Clara stood on her porch, overwhelmed. Men who looked like they could tear down buildings with their bare hands were now tending to her home with the care of master craftsmen. One biker, with a long gray ponytail and a tattoo of a coiled snake up his neck, approached her garden. He knelt, his massive frame looking almost comical next to the delicate, dormant rose bushes. He examined the trampled earth with a surprisingly gentle touch. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a gravelly rasp, "these bushes need better drainage, and this soil's too acidic." He looked up at her. "With your permission, we'll bring in some new topsoil and mulch. Protect them for the winter." Clara, speechless, simply nodded. Soon, the entire garden was being meticulously restored. The earth turned, the damaged plants carefully pruned, the ground prepared for a spring bloom she had lost hope of ever seeing. The community, shamed into action and inspired by the bikers' powerful display of loyalty, began to emerge from their homes. It started with Mrs. Gable, who returned with a whole tray of sandwiches and a large jug of iced tea. Then others followed, bringing coolers of water, bags of chips, and plates of cookies. They didn't know how to help with the construction, but they could offer sustenance. They set up a makeshift refreshment station on the sidewalk, a humble offering to the formidable crew that had taken over their street. The bikers accepted the offerings with quiet, appreciative nods. A bridge was being built, one sandwich and bottle of water at a time, between the wary neighborhood and the intimidating brotherhood. Late in the afternoon, Silas Thorne arrived. He turned onto the street in his polished sedan, expecting to see a broken widow and a house ripe for the taking. Instead, he was met with a scene from a surreal nightmare. The street was blocked by a fleet of motorcycles. His target property was swarming with Hell's Angels, who were actively repairing and fortifying it. His smug expression dissolved into a mask of disbelief and then stark terror. He slammed on his brakes, his car skidding to a halt a dozen yards from the chrome wall. Grizz, who had been overseeing the work, turned slowly. He didn't walk toward Thorne. He didn't have to. He just stood there, arms crossed, and stared. A few other bikers paused their work and turned as well, their gazes like chips of ice. The message was clear. There was no negotiation to be had. There were no more threats to be made. Thorne, the predator, was utterly outmatched. He stared for a long, silent moment at the impossible scene, at the house being reborn, at the silent, menacing figures who now claimed it. Without a word, he jammed his car into reverse, the tires squealing in protest, and sped away, his tail tucked firmly between his legs. He would not be coming back. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the transformed street, Grizz approached Clara on the porch. The house behind her was already looking stronger, prouder. The work was far from done, but the tide had turned. He held out a small, folded piece of leather. It was a patch, a support patch bearing the club's iconic death's head insignia. "Your family now, Clara," he said, his voice gentle. "No one will ever bother you again." "This is a promise." Clara took the patch, her trembling fingers tracing the stark, powerful image. It felt heavier than leather and thread. It felt like safety, like belonging, like honor. Tears she had held back for months finally fell. Not tears of sorrow, but of overwhelming, profound gratitude. The work continued for 2 more days. The bikers, a relentless and skilled force, systematically undid years of neglect and weeks of targeted decay. The leaky roof was patched and sealed. The faulty furnace, which Clara had dreaded all summer, was expertly serviced by a biker named Wrench, who, it turned out, had been a certified HVAC technician for 20 years. A new window replaced the one that had been cracked for a year. The entire house received a fresh coat of paint in the same pale yellow Mark had chosen decades ago. The porch was reinforced, its wood now solid and secure underfoot. The garden was a masterpiece of order and care, mulched and ready for winter, with a small, hand-carved sign hammered into the soil that read, "SGT Jensen's Roses." The community's support grew alongside the renovations. The trickle of offerings turned into a steady stream. Neighbors brought hot meals, cases of drinks, and offers to run errands. The street became a hub of activity, a place of shared purpose. The fear the bikers had initially inspired had completely transformed into a deep and abiding respect. They were no longer a threat. They were the neighborhood's fierce, honorable protectors. The children, initially kept inside, were now watching from their lawns, their eyes wide with wonder at the tattooed giants who could fix anything. On the 3rd morning, the work was done. The house stood proud and whole, a beacon of resilience on the quiet street. It looked more like a home than it had in years. The 62 motorcycles were lined up, engines silent, polished and ready to depart. The bikers gathered in front of the porch one last time, their job complete. They had asked for nothing in return. They had spoken little, but their actions had resounded like a cannonade. Clara stood on her newly painted porch, the support patch from Grizz clutched in her hand. She looked at the faces of the men before her, weathered, hard faces that now seemed familiar, even kind. She tried to find the words to thank them, but her throat was thick with an emotion too vast for language. Grizz stepped forward, sensing her struggle. "No need for words, ma'am," he said, his voice a low rumble. "We just paid a debt. Honor is its own reward." He put his sunglasses on, a signal that their business was concluded. He gave her a short, respectful nod, a gesture that was mirrored by every man behind him. It was a silent, collective salute. Then he turned and walked to his bike. One by one, the bikers mounted their machines. The quiet street was shattered by the simultaneous roar of 62 engines firing to life. The sound was no longer menacing. It was a declaration, a promise, a triumphant anthem of loyalty. It was the sound of protection. For a moment, they just sat there, the thunder of their idling engines shaking the ground, a final, powerful statement of their presence. Then, led by Grizz, they pulled away, a procession of chrome and leather, moving with the same disciplined grace with which they had arrived. Clara watched them go, her heart swelling with a feeling she hadn't known she was capable of. A profound sense of peace and belonging. The neighbors stood on their lawns, no longer hiding behind curtains, but standing openly, waving. They were not just waving goodbye to the bikers. They were acknowledging their own transformation. As the last motorcycle turned the corner, its taillight disappearing from view, the roar faded, leaving behind a ringing silence. But it was a different silence now. It was full, peaceful, and solid. Clara looked at her restored home, at the friendly, smiling faces of her neighbors. She was no longer the sad, isolated widow. She was Clara Jensen, the keeper of a hero's honor, a member of a fierce and loyal family, and the quiet, unshakable heart of her community. She opened her hand and looked at the patch, its stark skull a symbol not of death, but of a life fiercely protected. She was safe. She was home. And she was not alone.